Okay, good morning. Um, Welcome to our RPMA webinar for this month. Look, we're just going to wait for a few more people to jump on. So look, please pop your name in the chat and what area you're from, just so we can see where some of our attendees are coming from. So we'll just wait a minute or two, and then we'll jump on with the program for today. So. Just having a wee look at the chat. There's nobody there yet. Come on, guys, don't be shy. Okay. Hey, looks like we've got a good number of people that have already joined our webinar. Thank you, David from Hawke's Bay. And so I guess look, let's kick off. So today is our fourth webinar in the series, and today's title is Methamphetamine to Test or Not. My name is Carl Jackson, and I'm the facilitator for this webinar. I'm a franchisee with Pukeko Rental Managers. I've been with them for about 5 years, and I also sit on the current RPMA Council. Today, our presenter is David Pearse, and David is the franchisor for Pukeko Rental Managers, and he has about 30 franchisees within the organisation all around New Zealand. David was also the chairman of ProMins and then the chairman of the RPMA. He has a wealth of knowledge, and he also continues to manage his own portfolio in the Hawke's Bay as well. So in this session, David will discuss methamphetamine, the history of it and the political climate around this it's been going on for about the last 15 years. And then he'll be, I guess, guiding us to make the decisions for ourselves whether we decide to test or not. So without further ado, let's just remind everybody that if you have any questions, please put them in either the chat or the questions and answers. I'll be keeping an eye on that. And then at the end of the session, we'll endeavour to have David answer those questions for you. Please put them in as you think of them and as we go along. And so, David, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Carl. I will now try and share the PowerPoint, and hopefully everybody will be able to see that now. So that's great. So yes, the webinar I've been asked to speak about is methamphetamine to test or not to test. You can see that all right, Carl, can you?
Yes.
Yep, cool. So the first point I want to make is that it seems that methamphetamine is an issue, or has become a political football. And there's several players that I actually want to talk about first, just to give you a background as to the whole issue. And yeah, so one of those key issues or players in the actual methamphetamine debate is the first one is meth. And meth is an illegal substance. And methamphetamine is a Class A drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act and therefore attracts severe penalties. And possessing a pipe or a utensil for smoking methamphetamine is also an offence, which can result in 1 year jail or a fine of $1,000. And in the map I've just taken here of the police district, you can see where the heavy influence of meth is, and it's sort of there's less right down in Invercargill, but it gives you an idea of where the issue is at the present time. The issue with this first one, it's illegal substances, that those people in the political spectrum, we think, well, hang on, there's got to be consequences for people who are actually involved in illegal activities. So that's the viewpoint that comes in from here. Now, contrasting to that is there are groups, strong political lobby groups that are advocating for the removal of penalty for meth users. And with the Helen Clark Foundation and the New Zealand Drug Foundation are a couple of those that lead this, and they're pushing all the time and lobbying for regulatory changes and to remove the criminal penalties for possession of small quantities of methamphetamine, and that to legalise possession of drug utensils. So they're wanting to decriminalise it so that there's no penalties. And two, to regulate cannabis and other lower harm substances to provide safer alternatives to methamphetamine and to keep more people away from the illicit market. So basically there's that lobbying going on to actually say, hey, let's actually try and reduce methamphetamine by legalising cannabis, because it's a safer alternative. So you've got those players in the political, kicking that political football around. And lastly,
David, just before you carry on with this slide, is it possible to make your screen full size?
Okay. That's a good, hang on a minute. I'll just come back to that then. I will stop the share. Oh, so you're seeing the my view, are you?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I will try again. How's that? Is that any better?
Much better. Thank you, David.
All right, good. Phew. And the third issue is the cost to Kāinga Ora. And Kāinga Ora was our Housing New Zealand. It's owned by the Crown, and it provides rental housing for New Zealanders in need. And in the methamphetamine contamination Housing New Zealand's response of September in 2018, just 4 months after the Gluckman report, they actually printed this document. And it talks about and gives probably a little bit of an insight into the issues, the political football that's around the social housing. And between July 2013 and June 2018, Housing New Zealand, or Kāinga Ora, spent approximately $19 million on chemical testing and $101 million on decontaminating and restoring properties. So that's a huge amount of money. And so so that was a big issue. I think they're actually, the comment that I've had is the best guess is that they're spending at least $20 million a year on restoring properties and decontaminating, and they wanted to get that down from 20 million to 5 million. So that's a big political football there on its own. So in relation to the test, this report says around 1/5 of the properties, and I've put in 20% there, with a reading above the prevailing threshold at the time of testing, had a reading of 15 micrograms or higher. This provides an indication of the potential change in volumes of affected properties following Housing New Zealand's adoption of the 15 microgram as a threshold. So what you've got is Kāinga Ora or Housing New Zealand or the Crown simply saying, hey, we want to reduce the cost of testing and rehabilitation of properties. So we're actually only going to deal with those properties that are over 15 micrograms. And in fact, we're actually not going to test unless the police bring it to our attention. So you need to understand that that this is a huge financial situation that is behind the scenes. Now, the vast majority of rental housing, private and social, haven't been tested because of this since 2018, which is something to keep in mind. So they're the three players or political footballs making the decisions around this whole methamphetamine issue. The bottom line is, and this is the point I really want to make through this webinar, is meth is a health issue. Now, in the user, there's addiction and dependence, there's fatigue, there's mental depression, there's anxiety, there's paranoia, there's risk of self-harm, tooth decay, and their heart problems and stroke. And this comes from out of Methamphetamine, What You Should Know by Kay Davis in 2023. Now, in the environmental methamphetamine exposures and health effects from Flinders University in 2020, it actually does clearly say that from residual or third-hand exposure of methamphetamine, there comes sleep issues, respiratory effects, skin and eye effects, headaches, anxiety, depression, not thinking clearly, and fatigue. So I want to make it really clear that actual methamphetamine, the bottom line is it's a health issue and it affects people, and some people are more sensitive to it than others. Now, when it comes to the health issue, when it comes to testing, when it comes to research, there's something called a precautionary principle. And in that picture, it's just so appropriate for debate in our industry. You've got one guy looking over the lady and saying, prove that it's not safe. And you've got the lady saying, prove that it is safe. And that's the sort of like the debates that we actually the ball that goes backwards and forwards in this field. But I want to talk about this precautionary principle because the meaning of it, it's in research and science, the precautionary principle enables decision makers to adopt a precautionary measures when scientific evidence about the environmental or human health hazard is uncertain and the stakes are high. The precautionary principle applies where specific evidence is insufficient, inconclusive, or uncertain, and preliminary scientific evaluation indicates that there are reasonable grounds for concern that there are potentially dangerous effects on humans. Now, so where is the research in science? So that is the precautionary principle seems to have been ignored. It's in scientific circles, they all know about it, but when it comes to it, it's actually been ignored. And the trouble is that there's people like myself and others who are in the industry who are not willing to say that it is actually just safe over 15, just do whatever. It's because we hear stories, and we actually I've come across people in the early days who said that whenever they go into a meth contaminated house, their eyes twitches and they always know that there's meth in there. Now, that's never happened to me, and I think, oh yeah, okay, I'll take that on board. But since then, I've heard of some really horrific cases, like a property manager in New Plymouth that has gone into a property, and he actually went into a property and he had such a blinding headache that he actually had to leave and he had to take the day off work. When that property was tested, it came back at 8 micrograms, which is only half of the 15. And I know of another property management office north of Auckland who actually, the people who work there, they actually know when they go into a meth contaminated property over 5 because they actually can feel the effects on their body. So again, these sorts of anecdotal evidence that come forward really does raise a whole question mark over the 15. Sir Peter Gluckman chose to ignore the precautionary principle. He said, I can't find any evidence, this is a quote, I can't find any evidence that tertiary exposure causes negative health effects in humans, therefore increase the threshold 10 times and don't bother testing. So it was a big call. So I want to go through now the meth testing history for those people who might be in the industry just recently. In 2010, and yes, I was around then, Ministry of Health guidelines for remediation of clandestine methamphetamine laboratory sites came out at 0.5 micrograms per 100 square centimeters. And that was the start of this whole issue. And again, it wasn't really acted upon. It was just, if you come across a property that's actually been used as a meth lab, it's got to be cleaned down to 0.5. Then in 2017, 7 years later, we had the introduction of the Health and Safety at Work Act, and it applies now to residential rental properties, which was a bit of a shock at the time because everyone knew the Health and Safety at Work Act, but it applied to commercial premises. But with that, we were taught that any suspicion of the property having been smoked or manufactured meth places an obligation on the landlord to test. If a landlord rents a contaminated property, they'll be liable for a fine, And they will also, there's tribunal cases, repayment of a rent to the tenant, and also to replace the tenant's furniture if it's because it's been contaminated. So that was the start really at that time when we actually saw property management companies, most of them, all go out and start testing for meth. They all uncovered meth contaminated houses and they got them decontaminated. And so that was a huge part of our of what happened. Then in 2017, the same year, there was a review of the New Zealand standard. So a working party, which included at that time, we were involved with the IPMA, or Independent Property Managers Association, and there was a working party, including, of course, the Ministry of Health, reviewed the maximum level from 0.5 micrograms that had to be remediated back to 1.5. Now, it's important to note that the ESR, who wrote the reports, recommended not to increase, because this is going to become important soon. You'll find out the ESR is the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, and it's a key party in the body responsible for environmental science and research. Their biggest client is the New Zealand government, but they have not funded ESR to do the science and research required on methamphetamine. So then we go to 2018, just a year afterwards, and then we get the Gluckman report that most people would know about. Now, it's interesting that this was commissioned by the Minister of Housing, Phil Twyford, and mainly, I suspect, because of the huge reduction of cost that they wanted to bring down in social housing, where they were paying at least $20 million a year in testing and remediation. So in the Gluckman report, key points are that the exposure to methamphetamine levels below 15 micrograms would be unlikely to give rise to any adverse effects. And the remediation, according to the New Zealand standard, is appropriate only for identified former meth labs and properties where excessive methamphetamine use, as indicated by the high levels of methamphetamine contamination, has been determined. So the question I have with that is, how do you know that there's high levels of contamination if you don't test? So again, it's like walking around in the dark. The other key thing here in the report, because it was commissioned by Phil Twyford, the Minister of Housing, was he stated that trade-offs needed to be considered, especially within social housing, where the risk of being an unstable housing situation is more likely to be far greater risk than the risk of exposure at low levels of methamphetamine residues. So the Gluckman report has had a huge impact. Now, it's really important to actually make clear that in the conclusion, the very first paragraph of the conclusion of the Gluckman report, and it doesn't get much here, is that he says there is currently no evidence in either humans or animals that the levels typically resulting from third-hand exposure to meth smoking residues on household surfaces can elicit an adverse health effect. But then he goes on the next sentence to say, we note, however, that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence of an effect. There is a clear need for more research and a coordinated interagency effort to build a robust data set. So we hear a lot about the Gluckman report, but he actually says right in the very first paragraph of his conclusion that at the end of the day, the science has not been done. And the science needs to be done for there to be that robust data set that decision-making can be made on. There is, in the Gluckman report, a Dr. Nicholas Kim, who's a New Zealand toxicologist, and he's acknowledged within the Gluckman report, and his opinion was that he thought that a higher level of 12.5 micrograms would be roughly in accordance with the report when they're discussing the theoretical level of harm from residue. But he did go on to say, and his quote is, I wouldn't go up to the number I've mentioned of 12.5, but I could imagine a number of 3 micrograms per 100 cubic centimeters. That's where his opinion, because again, he's taken into account that level of safety, because again, the research hasn't been done. Now, what it's done is that here's a graph of Australia, New Zealand, and I don't know, about 20 states in America, where the methamphetamine decapitation results and what you can actually remediate down to. And we've got a situation where, from the Gluckman report, that the New Zealand public housing owned by the Crown, they were saying that they didn't have to decontaminate until under 15. But at the time, the New Zealand private houses under the New Zealand standard had to do 1.5. So the question is, you can see here that decision is right out of line of what other major countries that we deal with who have probably got more expertise with methamphetamine say that should happen. Now, straight after the Gluckman report, and I do mean straight after, the REA, the Real Estate Institute of New Zealand, and the Tenancy Tribunal pretty quickly then accepted the Gluckman report. And in the case of the RANZ REA, they actually stopped testing. My issue is with the Tenancy Tribunal. You have got an owner of a large number of properties, that's the Crown, with Kāinga Ora. They've said that they're not going to actually pursue or decontaminate under 15. And then the Tenancy Tribunal said, well, all properties in New Zealand, all private houses too, they will just make it the one set of rules. If you have any other issue and an owner says, I don't want to actually charge the tenant for something, then that's up to them. But I do have a problem personally about them actually making it so that everything was 15. Now, there is a real estate property management guru who said on a podcast that based on the Gluckman report, meth is not a problem, and he doesn't want to hear the word meth again. And he also stated that he would not disclose any test to a tenant that's under 15 micrograms. And I want to actually talk about that a bit further. With the decision to actually make it 15, it actually now has caused all sorts of different playing fields. The Standards New Zealand, or WorkSafe, that they still operate on 1.5. Kāinga Ora work on 15. The banks still work on 1.5. When you think banks, think mortgages. Insurance companies, the majority of them are still 1.5, but there are some companies, 1 or 2, that actually have moved to 15 since the Gluckman report. And the REA went to 15, and tenancy services is a mixture between 15 and 1.5. So now we've got a really horrific situation where there's a different playing fields. And that is why, in part, the HUD came out and the government came out with the next slide, which is the regulation on methamphetamine contamination in rental housing. So HUD, being the policy division of Housing New Zealand, came forward and said there's currently two different acceptable levels for meth contamination, one in New Zealand under the New Zealand standard and the other by Sir Peter Gluckman. They say, however, neither of these are mentioned in legislation, therefore neither are legally binding. Now so what they're saying is that we haven't got a clear situation, we need it in legislation. What they're proposing was that HUD preferred option was to actually make an option where 30 micrograms, which is twice the level of 15 in the Gluckman report, was deemed not to pose any risk, or the effects appear to be reversible. Now, that was a big call. I actually personally think it was a bridge too far. HUD was doubling down and saying that the maximum habitation issue is 30, so a tenant can stay in the property as long as it's under 30, and we can clean it down to 15, but we have to work around the tenant with chemicals and sprays and hazard gear and that sort of thing. And then having their furniture still stay there, which are contaminated. It was a bit of a nightmare. So the issue is that then ECR in their report, they said that they did not consider that there was sufficient evidence to define a maximum inhabitable level for methamphetamine, and no evidence was available. So that was a bridge too far for ESA report. So you had them say they didn't want to go from 0.5 to 1.5 when National was previously in government. I think at the time the Minister of Housing for National wanted it to be about 5, but it only was 1.5 it went to. Then they came out and said 15's okay, and now they're actually saying, well, hang on, this is 30 is getting too far out of it. The issue is that this legislation, while Labor did not have time to implement it for the election, we have not heard from Chris Bishop on what his status on this legislation is. So we're trying to get several companies and interested stakeholders are trying to get hold of Chris Bishop to find out whether this has been shelved or left, but it does not do away with the issue that we need to have a clear direction. And my personal opinion is that the New Zealand standard is the level. So the New Zealand standard involves the Ministry of Health. At the present time, since the Gluckman report, the Ministry of Health hasn't been there. I have asked the HUD at this time of this legislation, where is the Ministry of Health in all this? And they just simply said, well, the Minister of Health sits around the table with the Minister of Housing and the Cabinet. So that's the only answer I could get on that. So research. What is this ongoing research that even Sir Peter Gluckman said that we should be doing? Well, there is a lady, a Dr. Jackie Wright, who is a researcher at the Flinders University in Adelaide, and she continues to undertake research into the public impacts of the use of illicit drugs in society. And this includes the nature of drug exposures, locations, where exposure can occur, the pathways of exposure, as well as the potential for adverse health effects. So the team at Flinders are undertaking an ongoing projects, and much of the research taken that they're looking at relates to third-hand exposures to methamphetamine drug residues from manufacture and from use. However, works is also undertaken in relation to second-hand exposures, environmental exposures to other illicit drugs, precursors and waste products, and scientific exposures by children and remediation methods. So she's actually doing the full research. She was sidelined in the Gluckman report, just mentioned there, as there wasn't enough evidence, but she's going for it now. And there's that team at Flinders who are being involved in this. And I've just heard last week that there's an elderly lady who was suffering health problems. She went to the doctor. The doctor said, I don't know what's wrong. They tested the place for meth to find that there's actually a high level of meth residue. So she has been, we're trying to actually get her as another one, or people trying to get her involved with this Flinders University. So that's the sort of thing. They're actually wanting more people. So if anyone hears of any cases, certainly Dr. Jackie Wright would love to hear from them. Right, I want to go now into a meth case that's happened to me in the last few weeks. And this meth case example is of Hastings property. And after the tenant was in the property for a month, a baseline meth test was done. And the results showed that there were 10 out of the 10 tests, an average of 1.1 micrograms. Now, this says that there's a theoretical maximum of 11.4. Now, I have to explain that if 10 samples are taken and the average of those samples are 1.14, then they say the theoretical maximum is if one of those rooms had only the meth contamination. Now, the reality is that's not the case. It's usually spread. But what point I'm wanting to make here is that under the Health and Safety at Work Act, if that theoretical maximum was 15 or more, is there a duty of care from a property management company to actually go and have a detailed assessment room by room to see if one of those rooms are over 15? So now with this property, there was a dispute between the tenant and a flatmate, and a comment was made to me that the flatmate had been using meth. So I had no other option under the Health and Safety at Work Act to actually get a suspicion test. And when I got it done, the results came back that the average was 3.4. Now that's an increase from 1 point, was it 1 point? Yeah, from 1.14 from the original test. The theoretical maximum in this case is that one room theoretically could have 34 micrograms of meth in it. So at the end of the day, I believe that that is a case of actually responsibility for actually doing a detailed meth assessment. So we did. And in the detailed assessment report, the methamphetamine contamination above 1.5 was only in 6 of the 10 rooms. The high use rooms and living space tested was living room, laundry, hallway, bathroom, bedroom 1 and 2. And what I've got here is a clips from the report, which shows that the 2 bedrooms, while the average was 3, in the bedrooms, the highest one was 9.4, the other was 7.6. So you need to actually understand that even though a meth test might be, if some guru says 14.9, I'm not going to tell anybody, there is a good chance that some of those rooms in that house could be 30. And that's something that at the end of the day, if it ever came down to a case, I don't think that they have much leg to stand on, because they should have actually owed that duty of care and responsibility to get it tested. In this case, the owner had taken the baseline meth test or their screening assessment report at the start. So I was able to show that the tenant or occupants had caused the rise in the meth contamination. The tribunal gave possession back to the landlord, as the decontaminated property needed, for the decontamination, company needed the property to be vacant to actually do their sprays and their chemicals. The tribunal ordered the tenant to pay the insurance excess, and the property has been decontaminated below the 1.5, the New Zealand standard. I had a cup of tea actually yesterday with the owner, and she's very, very happy with the tenant paying the excess. She's got the house cleaned up at no cost to herself. The key recommendations that I would make would be that as a professional to actually talk to your owners is make sure that an insurance company that they're with will decontaminate a property down to the New Zealand standard of 1.5, because there's companies like Vero that will only decontaminate if it's over 15 and then bring it below 15, which is of a major concern. You're not actually cleaning the property up. And another strong recommendation would be, in this case, is where the owner took out loss of rent insurance, so that they are actually still getting paid for the rent even while the property has been getting decontaminated. Right, so now we come to the big thing. This is the seminar's all about. With that background, to test or not to test, and we'll go with not to test. If you choose not to test, then you'll know that you will not know the status of the property. You'll be waiting on someone to say, a neighbour or something, to say that there's an issue, or in this case, with that example, was from the tenant. Your property will be at risk of getting contaminated because there's no consequences. You'll still be under the Health and Safety at Work Act to run a suspicion test if you suspect that there is a drug issue. You risk the owner's insurance or mortgage if a test is not done. Again, remembering that a lot of those mortgage banks and insurance are still at 1.5. And you will be unable to make the tenant liable. And in fact, the tenant gets a get out of jail free card, and they can move to another property. And if you do, any potential property manager or landlord does a background check on them, it will not show that they've been involved in meth. And you may become that property management, which we never want to be, that cost the owner a lot of money. And in the case of this example of in Hastings, it would cost about $25,000. So the decision to test means that you're offering a professional service and you're managing risk. You're telling any potential tenant, if they rent from you, they will be held responsible if they contaminate the property. There's going to be consequences. Any new tenant knows that they're renting a meth-free home, and you are protecting the value of the owner's property, because there's nothing worse than going to sell a property and a potential purchaser tests for meth to find it's contaminated and it affects the value of the property. So we're going to open for questions, but Carl, but before I do, there's a question I want to ask, and I'm not going to get an answer from, but it's a rhetorical question. What happens if new research from Flinders University, or like Dr. Nicholas Kim said that he wouldn't go above 3, what if they're correct? What if new research is produced that confirms serious health issues with meth residue over 5 micrograms and properties over this are overnight deemed uninhabitable? That's the concern. And a big part of residential property management is managing risk. So I'll just stop sharing there, Carl, and have we got any questions?
No worries. I'm just yeah, thank you very much, David. Very, very informative. So I was just trying to find my my questions and answers. Look, I have one quickly myself. I realize we've gone over time a little bit, but if you're working with owners, David, how do you overcome the objection from owners when they say that's a waste of time? I don't want to waste my money on that.
Yeah, sure. You might get owners like that. I don't. But you might get owners like that, and under that situation, to protect you under the Health and Safety at Work Act, you would actually get them to sign an opt-out form. And in that opt-out form, you would have it where you're disclosing to them that they're making the choice that they don't want to test for meth, and also that if there is a suspicion test, you still have to go and test under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And so they have to bear the consequences of that. The reality is, Carl, is that when I say to owners, one, you don't want these people who use meth to rent the property. You don't want them in their property. And two, you want them to be made liable if they do contaminate the property. I've found that my owners actually have no problem with paying the $240 odd to actually get it tested.
Thank you, David. So I've got a few questions that have come in now. I'll start with Pauline Johnson. Pauline says at the start of the tenancy, the meth test is negative, and when the tenants leave and the test is positive but under 1.5, what can happen to the tenant? I guess that's medical wise under 1.5. Is there any evidence as to how it can affect tenants in the future?
Well, at the end of the day, you've got to take them to tribunal and you've got to win at the tribunal. If it was 1.5, there's a theoretical maximum of 15. The reality is the chances of any room being over 15 at the present legislation, it's one of those things. If you notice in my example, it was 1.14, but we made the choice not to do anything because, again, we wouldn't win at tribunal. But again, it's a matter of proving. So it is a difficult question to ask. I think at the end of the day, yes, if there is a slight increase, you've got to make that judgment call of whether you want to go to the tribunal to say that they have contaminated it. But again, at those low levels, I think that you'd want to be, if you're going to go for a fight and get involved in that, my personal opinion at the moment with legislation as this and the ruling of the Tenancy Tribunal, I wouldn't do it above 1.5.
No, thank you, David.
Over 1.5, I certainly would.
There's a couple of questions coming in on the chat as well, which is around the standard. So we've got one from Amanda that says, "What's the current standard, I believe, for residential rental property 15 or 1.5. And I know you've mentioned that, but maybe you can just crystallize that a bit, Amanda.
Yeah, at the moment, they're saying that there's no health issues unless it's over 15. So if it the trouble we have got as property management professionals is, as I've shown in that example, is that at what stage do you take responsibility, or do you do a test to find out if any of those rooms are over 15? And it's clear to me that if you've got 5 micrograms or more, there's a good chance that one of those rooms are over 15, and it's a health issue. And at the end of the day, any rooms over 15 should be decontaminated. Again, you've got to make sure that you're with a good insurance company that will decontaminate below the 1.5.
No,
I
thank
hope
you,
that
David.
answered the question, Carl.
Yep. So Nikki Smith says, so what's the stance from the RPMA on the limits for testing? Now, David, as post chair, you've probably got more knowledge on that than me.
The RPMA have made submissions saying that we do not believe that 15 is safe, and we're certainly against it being lifted to 30, where a tenant can stay on a property as long as it's under 30. That's just ridiculous for us. At the moment, we made a really clear case, and what's happened is that it's just Labor said that they ran out of time. I think there's more to it than that, but they actually didn't pursue it anymore. So we need to know now what this national government is going to be doing, national coalition government is going to do about it. But we will be still strongly advocating that the New Zealand standard should be the New Zealand standard. The Ministry of Health needs to be involved, and we need the more research. And we know that at least Jackie Wright from Flinders University is doing that research, because that's going to be really important. So at the moment, it's scary because at the end, the research is not done. At the moment, it's all theoretical.
Okay, thank you, Dave. We've got more questions coming in. So we've got Vaifu says that we're dealing with current meth contamination cases at the moment, and you've mentioned someone who would like stats and cases. Who could they contact? Are you that person they could contact, David, and have a chat with?
Definitely, yeah.
Awesome, awesome.
So
We've also
at the end, I'll leave up a slide with my contact details on.
Fantastic. So look, there's just two more questions or comments that have come through, and I think we'll then end there. So under a break lease situation, could the cost of a new meth test be recovered from the existing tenant as part of the break lease fee? So, for example, meth
At
test.
the moment,
Yep.
my experience of the tenancy tribunal is no. The adjudicators will not actually pay for that. You think they should, but no, they actually say, well, the rulings that I've been involved with, the tenancy adjudicator has not allowed us to get reimbursed for that.
Okay, no, thank you, David. And one last was from Tom Green. So he's saying that he was under the impression that the composite testing went the other way. For example, they combine the sample and get a total maximum, which then has to be separated in the individual testing, so the individual samples would be lower. What's your take on that, David?
No, the initial test that you do, the swabs to actually do the ingoing, there's 10 swabs, and they find the average over those 10 swabs, and that's what they produce. And then in the report, they actually give a theoretical maximum of what it would be if just one room would be. That's in all the testing I do, and I do hundreds of tests every year. That's the reports that I get. It might be different with a different company, but that's how it works. So yes, the test, the number that you get is an average. Yeah, is that? I'm just. Is that answer, Carl? Do you think the question?
Yeah. I think it does. I think it does,
Yeah.
David. And that's my understanding as well. Is that it's taken across, and then as you say, it could be just one of those rooms that
Yeah.
has that
So
high amount.
so there's no reason for someone to say a 15.9 everything's fine. No, that's only just the average. it's most likely that there'll be rooms that'll be a lot higher than that. And as we found in
Awesome.
my example that I've just given, it's in the bedroom because I'm really quite ignorant, but I've learned a lot being a property manager. And one of them is I didn't realize that meth is a stimulant in the bedroom. So that's where you actually get a lot of the contamination.
No worries. Look, one last cheeky little question, which is, how do we find the best qualified meth test company? Because I know there are people out there offering that, and this one also comes from Amanda, who are offering the service. But how do we know we're getting the job done correctly? Who should we go to?
It's the Meth Association, Decontamination Association. They actually have got a society of their own, and they've been lobbying government over this. So I just go online and look for Meth Decontamination Association or Meth Testing Association and choose from one of those.
Fantastic. Look, we have gone over by quite a bit, but there's some really good questions
Oh,
there. I'd like to
okay.
to. It's all right,
I'll
David. There's lots of really detailed information there. Look, I'd like
I'll
to
just
thank everybody.
yeah. Just before that
And
people do, if there's somebody who actually wants to know or wants further training, I've come across this course that's done by SHH Solutions, an intermediary meth awareness training program. And so again, if you're wanting to know about the risks, again, these are the experts involved in it. And I'd recommend that you actually go and see them. And here is my details if people want to have any advice on tribunal cases.
fantastic. So once again, thank you everybody for attending the seminar today, or webinar, I should say. And look, the link will also be sent out to everybody that has attended so that you can go back and look through, because I know there's a lot of information there to digest. David, thank you very much for presenting today, and enjoy the
My
rest of your
pleasure.
day.
Okay.